Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for your resilience and your dedication in making it through the torrent of rain to get here. My name's Susan McVie and I'm the Director of AQMeN. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here to the 2017 AQMeN Annual Lecture, our 7th such lecture to be held since we were established in 2009. I love the title of tonight's lecture, Numbers and Stories, and I'm going to tell you a couple of stories, but I'm going to start with the housekeeping issues. Somebody has to. Toilets are back down the incredibly ornate staircase that you came up here and almost on the way back out, so it's kind of literally right underneath where we are now. Mobile phones, if you've got one in your pocket, could you set it to silent? There are no scheduled fire alarms that we're aware of, so if the fire alarm does go off, please make a hasty exit to the back of the room. We're filming the lecture this evening, and I think Fiona did send out information to say that if you didn't want to be in the film, to let her know, but I'm assured that the filming will be at this end of the room rather than across the room, so unless you do a moonwalk in front of the screen here, you're not likely to be picked up by the cameras. And just for those of you with twitchy fingers, there's the AQMeN Twitter feed there, and we've got hashtag AQMeNAL if you want to send out any little messages to friends who weren't able to come. Numbers and stories. So let's start with a story. You are sitting in one of the university's most iconic rooms, the Playfair Library, and it is characterised by William Playfair's neoclassical barrel vaulted ceiling, which is very beautiful, completed in 1831. And although he was born in Russell Square in London, William Playfair is known as one of the greatest Scottish architects of the 19th century. But what is less well known about William Playfair is that his uncle, also William Playfair, was a pioneer of information graphics. William Playfair Sr. was born in a great period of Scottish history, the Scottish Enlightenment, which of course was a golden age of arts, science, industry and commerce. And in an article published in 2001, Playfair was described as a very colourful figure and a man of many occupations. He was in turn a millwright, an engineer, a draftsman, an accountant, an inventor, a silversmith, a merchant, an investment broker, an economist, a statistician, a pamphleteer, a translator, a publicist, a land speculator, a convict, a banker, an ardent royalist, an editor, a blackmailer, and a journalist. So it may be said that he was something of a rogue and a scoundrel. But he is of particular relevance to tonight's lecture and also to AQMeN in general, because he argued that charts communicated information better than tables of numbers. In his political and his economic writings, he often used numerical examples and calculations to make a point, and he found that making sense of this information was aided enormously by using statistical graphs. Playfair was the founder of graphical methods of statistics and invented several types of diagrams, including the line graph, the bar chart, the pie chart, and the circle graph. So the next time you're creating a line graph or a bar chart, think back to this magnificent room and to the achievements of the great Scottish Enlightenment. In a moment, I'm going to introduce the chair for this evening's lecture, who will formally introduce our distinguished speaker. But I did just want to say what a pleasure it is to have Sharon Witherspoon with us for the lecture. I've long admired Sharon's work and experienced firsthand, when she was director of the Nuffield Foundation, her deep and abiding passion for social science research. And despite holding such a senior role within the organisation, Sharon was always keen to work directly with research grant holders to bring out the absolute best in terms of the robust research and data analysis, but also to ensure far-reaching and enduring impact on policy and practice. And for that, I'm personally very thankful for her support, and it certainly, I think, affected the way that I do my work in a very profound way. As this marks the 7th, and for the time being, the final AQMeN lecture, I also wanted to say a few words, really just to reflect on the journey that AQMeN has been on over the last 8 years. As many of you will know, we were funded by the ESRC and the Scottish Funding Council in 2009 through to 2012. as a training and a capacity building initiative, ostensibly to fill a major gap in the quantitative capability of Scottish social science. And it might be hard to believe now, looking back, looking at the success of the QSTEP centres in Edinburgh and in Glasgow, and the Scottish big data landscape, which is being transformed by centres such as the ADRC Scotland, the Urban Big Data Centre in Glasgow, and the Alan Turing and the FAR Institutes, which are based partly in Scotland. But the situation just a decade ago was very, very different. A scoping study that was published in 2007 found that the provision of quantitative teaching and research within social science was patchy, and although there were some distinct pockets of expertise, there was little evidence that these skills were being exploited or shared to their maximum potential. The report recommended that there should be strategic investment in methods training to build a critical mass of quantitatively trained social scientists in Scotland. And thankfully, the ESRC and the Scottish Funding Council funded AQMeN, a pan-Scottish interdisciplinary network of academics, to develop and deliver a programme of training events aimed at addressing the deficit in quantitative skills amongst social scientists in Scotland. In 2009, a small executive committee of academics from across Scotland and a core team of administrative staff set out to create a programme of training events that would meet the needs of researchers from across a broad range of different disciplinary areas and at a wide range of different levels. So we were running everything from 10-day introductory fast-track courses through to 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5-day advanced masterclasses. We introduced people to a broad range of analytical approaches by offering them methods taster events and helped to exploit a range of Scottish data sets by offering detailed instructions on both the data and all their methodological foibles. And for those who were stuck on specific problems, we offered statistical consultancy and a blog for discussing particular methodological issues. We organised knowledge exchange events aimed at those who didn't wish to dabble in the black arts of statistics themselves, but wished to become more familiar with how quantitative research could be applied and interpreted. And through a small series of collaborative grants, we funded the establishment of 8 seed corn projects, several of which have gone on to become much bigger projects. In 2013, through funding from the ESRC, the AQMeN Training Initiative became the AQMeN Research Centre, and we branched out into developing a programme of quantitative research in 3 broad policy areas. Firstly, crime and victimisation. I'm sure that that would have amused Playfair. Also, education and social stratification, and urban segregation and inequality. And the programme of research offered a new way to build capacity in quantitative methods, also to exploit a wide range of existing data sets, and to promote our work through a range of knowledge exchange events. But staying true to our core objectives, we continue to offer a programme of training events in a broad range of statistical techniques to showcase survey and administrative data sets and to organise knowledge exchange events to share findings of our research with a broad range of academics. And what was wonderful about it being part of the AQMeN Research Centre was that we were able to offer most of that free of charge. Since 2009, we have run a total of 95 training courses over 177 days, which has benefited over 1,700 participants. We've also distributed over 450 detailed training manuals to those who requested them, again, free of charge. We're in the process of evaluating our training at the moment. So if you do have a questionnaire that pops into your inbox, do fill it out. But our earlier evaluation showed that we have made significant impacts in terms of boosting quantitative capacity in some areas of deficit within social science. We've increased the usage of some severely underexploited data sets and contributed to the expansion of quantitative staffing in several universities. But more than that, I think our research programme, which to all intents and purposes did in fact start from scratch in 2012, has been hugely successful in terms of developing and generating a host of new knowledge from old or at least existing data. Now, I'm not here to give a mini lecture on our research, but I'm very proud to have been part of a research team that's significantly increased our knowledge about social inequalities across 3 broad areas of social science, and to have started to make a major impact in terms of social and political change. But rather than me tell you about it, I want to play you a short video at this point. The video was created as part of our two-day international conference on rediscovering inequalities, which was held in October last year. And it includes contributions from myself and some of my research collaborators and from some of the other international experts who have helped us along the way. So I hope you enjoy our short video. I hope that's given you a flavour of the research that we've been involved in, probably in a kind of much quicker way than I could have done. But I think it's particularly important in terms of creating a better understanding of social inequalities for the rich seam of quantitative data sets that we have available, and the UK is perfectly placed to do that kind of work. I'm also delighted to say that we've recently been awarded some further funding, so we will be able to carry on with this programme of research over the next 3 years. So if you're a policymaker and a practitioner and you're interested in getting involved in that work, then do get in touch with us. If you're an academic who's interested in this area and want to collaborate, then again, get in touch. Back to this evening's lecture, and I wish to offer a warm and sincere welcome to Patrick Sturgis, our chair for the evening. Patrick is a Professor of Research Methodology and Director of the National Centre for Research Methods at the University of Southampton. Amongst many other things, Patrick is an expert in areas of survey methodology, public opinion and political behaviour, so you can imagine he's not short of things to do at the moment. He chairs the Advisory Committee of Understanding Society, which of course one of our flagship data sets funded by the ESRC, and is past president of the European Survey Research Association. Patrick's a specialist in structural equation modelling and has run many courses on that subject, including a few up here in Scotland, and he's something of an internet sensation, with several YouTube videos of confirmatory factor analysis and structural equation modelling receiving thousands of views, although his videos are not, as I understand it, quite sufficient to impress his son. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Susan. It's a great video. It's amazing what some sort of Michael Nyman on repeat can add a bit of profundity to what you say, but it's really nice to see some of the great work that you've been doing, and it's a real pleasure to be here in these wonderful surroundings. I think we can forgive Mr. Fairplay, given all his other achievements, the invention of the terrible pie chart. Susan's described really the sort of the history and what AQMeN has done, and I guess from what I can tell you is, as you know, I've been involved with AQMeN since the start, on the advisory board, initially as a member of the advisory board, and now chairing the advisory committee in the second round of funding. And so I've kind of been able to see how it's evolved and the good work that it's done over the period. And I think it's been interesting to see those changes from the initial idea of AQMeN, which, as Susan said, came out of the review that really identified the shortage of quantitative methods. Of course, this isn't a problem that's unique to Scotland, but that was where the sort of the genesis of the idea came from, and the name AQMeN, network. It was about building networks of people, and I remember coming to the first advisory board meeting and hearing what the kind of ambition was for AQMeN, and kind of thinking, good luck with that, because it isn't, it isn't the sort of high glamour end of academia, trying to build capacity in methodology, even though it's widely recognised that this is needed. There's a lot of kind of institutional resistance. There's many people who are invested in kind of opposing quantitative methods. We'll perhaps hear some of this from Sharon in a moment, but nonetheless, AQMeN was a great success. It did experience difficulties in delivering on those objectives, but nonetheless, it was able to reach out and build a network of people, some of whom are here this evening, and to provide support to people who often were the sort of the quants person in the sociology department. And so, was a great success in that initial phase. And then has transitioned to incorporate a really impressive program of research focused on inequalities, as you've heard, stretching out beyond Scotland to international links, not just in the UK, but with Duke, University of Iowa, Cologne universities. There have been a huge number of PhD students that have gone through the sort of AQMeN program. And yeah, it's been a real pleasure. As Susan said, I've been up here on many occasions to give the odd lecture and to talk about structural equation modelling, yes, which you're right, although I am a YouTube sensation, the topic of my videos doesn't impress my children. So I think it's I mean, in some ways it's a bit of a sad moment, the idea that this is perhaps the last of the AQMeN lectures, but it's great news to hear, which I didn't know this until I was reading the final report that we'll be considering in the advisory committee tomorrow, that Susan and the team have been successful in getting another large grant, which, while has a new acronym, largely continues the team and the sort of the focus and so on, develops it in interesting ways. So I think that's really good news that we can celebrate that continuity. And I hope somehow you can find a way to continue with the AQMeN name. Maybe we'll talk about this tomorrow, because one of the great successes is that brand. People know the name AQMeN, and they know, maybe they don't know exactly what you do, but they know that it's about quantitative methods and increasingly about policy research. And I guess I should finish on my remarks about AQMeN by acknowledging the key role of Susan McVie, who has been a real force of energy. As I said, to start this off in an area which isn't the glamour end of things, wanting to build capacity, help people to develop their skills and so on. But Susan has been absolutely enthusiastic about that from the start, and has been the driving force in delivering one grant after another, a huge success. And so I think I do agree, again, from the draft report, with the description of the director as providing strong and stable leadership throughout, actually an appropriate use this time. So I'm very pleased to be here on this auspicious occasion, and to introduce the speaker for the final AQMeN lecture, who very appropriately, given the comments I've been making about wanting to build capacity in quantitative methods, we could scarcely have a more appropriate person to deliver this lecture. So Sharon Witherspoon is the head of policy at the Academy of Social Sciences, and she leads the very important campaign for social science that the Academy runs. Her early years in the deep south of the United States are shrouded in mystery, but she somehow ended up in London in the early 1980s, working at what was then social and community planning research, working on kind of government evaluations of various kinds, and probably most notably being one of the founding team for the long-standing series of British social attitude surveys. She then spent many years at the Nuffield Foundation, initially working on the grant giving program, and then subsequently as director. Probably most notably there, I guess, for her work on the Q-STEP program, which is an enormous and thus far very successful program to increase the skills of undergraduates in quantitative methods. Very ambitious program, a huge amount of work to build that consortium of the Nuffield Foundation, ESRC, HEFCE and others to get that going. She's also now chair of the Administrative Data Resource Network, I think that's also called the Big Data Network, and convened the UK Statistics Authority, convened by the Stats Authority with the ESRC. She was awarded an MBE for services to social science in 2008 and received the British Academy President's Medal in 2011, and was awarded an honorary doctorate by UCL in 2015 for science services to social science and law. So it's a great pleasure to hand over to Sharon Witherspoon.
Well, thank you very much for coming out on a night like tonight. And I want to again echo the thanks to AQMeN for inviting me here. As Susan knows, and I can't remember how long ago we first met in the context of work on the Edinburgh Youth Study, I have a real passion and commitment about the importance of robust evidence in the social sciences, both as an aid to understanding, but much of my own work and career has been about the role that evidence should play in policy formation, policy evaluation, changing practice of people like teachers or social workers, and in wider public discussion. And of course, many of these things are at the heart of what has been AQMeN's changing mission. So I was truly honored and very flattered to be asked to come. And I want to echo Susan's words about this wonderful venue with Playfair. Now, you would expect someone with the Scottish surname of Witherspoon to take particular pleasure in that, and especially someone who shares the surname with a famous alumnus of Edinburgh University, also a member of the Edinburgh Enlightenment, I think a distant though indirect relative, the Presbyterian John Witherspoon, who left these shores, an evangelical hellfire Presbyterian preacher, to go and become a president of Princeton University, and ended up a political radical, signing the US Declaration of Independence, of course being anti-English probably helped with that, and also, though, being very much on the radical end of the debates about the formation of the new country. So although this hall was built some years later, it does still seem to me to symbolize Enlightenment values, rational discourse, that most scientists, and I include social scientists as scientists, wish to uphold. And I certainly always have done in my professional career and my work at the foundation, and my work at the academy, tried to be clear about the difference between my views, my values, and what I thought really the evidence was saying. Now, I'd like to claim some prescience about choosing a topic about fake facts and false news and the post-fact world when we're in the final few days of an election campaign, but I have to admit that was entirely serendipitous, since we planned this long before this election was seemingly going to happen just now. And in fact, one of the early dates we considered for the talk was on June 8th. So I'm very glad that we were lucky enough to avoid that. But one of the interesting things I'll observe is while in this election, in these aisles, at this time, has certainly been one in which discussions of false news, fake fact, post-fact have been bandied about, and I have no doubt, I have seen that they've made their appearances in social media adverts, in exchanges on Twitter and so on, tailored often to groups or individuals whose views they seek to influence. I think it's probably fair to say that the actual wholesale retailing of fake news and alternative facts has been less prevalent in this election than in the last few in the United Kingdom, particularly if you think of the Scottish referendum, the Brexit referendum, and certainly less wholesale than in the United States presidential election. So there just seem to me fewer cases in this election where widespread public debate is being driven by actual questions of whether or not something is factually true. And that was not the case in the last few referendums. And I'm going to argue that's really quite complicated enough to have that happen in an election campaign. But it is more prevalent in social media. We know it's a function of a lot of advertising to, under the guise of facts, mobilize emotions, get people to vote, not usually get them to change their mind, get them to turn out. And that in some ways that actually undermines the notion of public discussion altogether. So that's the sort of background for now, but I really hadn't planned to give this talk during an election. So I think I want to use that to heighten the importance of the argument I do want to make about the difficulties in the relationship between evidence, particularly number-based evidence in the social sciences and their use in policy and in public debate, and how we actually need to think a bit smarter about these nowadays. I always start these talks by making what I hope is an obvious point, but I think it's important to state it anyway. I do not start from a position that says number-based evidence is the sole or always superior method in social science analysis. Qualitative techniques, small-scale studies, ethnographies and the like, case studies, are of course valuable as means of understanding social processes, generating hypotheses, helping us understand more about how people may organize their own personal narratives or identities, and often even understanding the mechanisms by which the relationships we uncover in statistical analysis may be working. And Rob Sampson, one of the people who gave the talk in the film about neighborhood, I think was actually, with John Laub, one of the authors of one of the best uses of quant and qual I've seen, which was understanding why marriage seemed to be helpful in the 50s and 60s in turning people who then labeled juvenile delinquents away from crime. But if you understand that through qualitative techniques, why that might be, it wasn't because the wives, because all the juvenile delinquents were men in that study, boys, the wives weren't being really supportive and helpful and friendly and loving. They were being tough and firm and taking the money and saying, I'll give you the money, your allowance, so you don't hang out with your friends. And the ones who managed to live through that version of marriage did have a kind of lifelong protective factor. Now that's a simplification. I've told you a story, but it's based on numbers and stories, and that qualitative research really got underneath why we needed not to think that it was because being married was nice and comforting and life-affirming and bolstering of self-esteem and all sorts of other things people might have said. So that's a very good example, but in fact, that's not what I'm going to talk about here. I'm not going to talk about why we need numbers and qualitative evidence. I think most of us know that now. I hope we're past the world where these things are either or. I think it's still clear that despite all the work we're doing, we need even more, proportionately speaking, number and data-driven social science, not just number and data-driven analysis, but I'm going to talk about why it's important it's embedded in social science. And I think we need to take all of that seriously, and nor am I going to make an argument that all social science has to be useful. It just so happens that a lot of what I'm talking about are cases where they are. But I hope I wanted to just open up some wider questions about quantitative social science, or in friendlier words that I try to use more and more often these days, social science that use data and numbers in today's world, and our obligations, or at least the obligations that some of us ought to feel, to ensure that it plays its role responsibly and as fully as possible. It does seem to me, but I would say that as someone who's accepted a post at something called a Campaign for Social Science, that social sciences can be a force for good, for the quality of public debate, of policy choice, and actually for increasing a sense that there is a democratic public sphere and can make the world a better place. But I would say that, wouldn't they? But what I want to do is talk about how we might do more of what we need to do with numbers, but we probably need to think differently about stories too. Now, as I said, coming back to post-fact world, I think, it is clear that there are concerns about this, and as I am a trustee of an excellent charity called FAcSS, which spends a lot of time using all kinds of evidence, including from the UK Statistics Authority, but also good, robust academic evidence, much of it number-driven, to try to counteract false rumors, false news, to manifesto check in a way that the Institute for Fiscal Study does about economics, but also say what's going on with housing policy, or what do we think we know about schooling, or whatever. And truly difficult to be objective and hold on to that word fact, which we all know is a slight epistemological sleight of hand anyway. But I mean, we have to say facts may be constructed, but some are truer than others. And I think it's fair enough to say that social media, the internet and so on, have increased the extent to which people can and do select their own versions of the news, without the filtering of press or television publishers. And that's also probably coincided with the decline of political parties, churches, trade unions, other social institutions which previously had some sort of role of constructing grand narratives. Not that they felt that way, it was just something that made sense of the world for people. And that too has coincided with some of the discontents of globalization. Now that's about as grandiose as I'll get, because I do know that historians are far better placed than I, and probably only with hindsight, which is never really that helpful when you're trying to predict the future, to give us a sense of what is generally different about this compared to previous ages. But it does seem to us amateurs and the commentariat that something's going on, and that we have on the one hand the big forces of global companies, and on the other the atomized individual, and this creates conditions ripe for fake news, often funded by big donors of various sorts, vested interests, or just started as a virus, but part of a more individualized society. And yet, I like to think I'm a social scientist, and I look around and I say, we're a better educated society than at any time in history. People are generally less deferential, and although that can feel jolly inconvenient, it's probably a good thing. They're more able to actively search for information if they want. Try to compare this election to an 18th century election in a rural shire in England or Scotland or Wales, and you wonder who was getting more fake news. So I don't want to assume that there was some golden age of facts and truth, when in fact, those of us who's been trying to use evidence to influence policy or practice kind of feel it's always been a bit of an uphill struggle. That I can't think of any time over the last 30 or so years I've been doing it that felt like a golden age, and I doubt there ever was. And I sort of think it is more difficult for quantitative social science in some ways. So I want to pick that theme up. Why is it so difficult? What could we do better before I get on to a second part of my argument about stories? I note that today's political world and policy world often does give lip service, at least, to evidence-informed policy. And there are pockets that care about this, and I certainly think we've set up some institutions that help more, the What Works Center, some of the funding again by the research councils, the sense that it's a good thing if at least some research branch in the civil services or civil service senior civil service people understand what the evidence might be saying. I know here in Scotland there's more of an open door between academe and I think what goes on in the civil service than there might be down in Westminster, where once a civil servant you tend to stay there and not go out. And some of today's politicians are really interested in the evidence, but the rhetoric doesn't always mean they're avidly seeking it. It's always easier to hear evidence that confirms the views you already hold. I think we social science analysts actually feel that ourselves. It's harder to be skeptical when the evidence confirms what you think you know from your own views. And they all are also affected by values and views about the good society. So I don't think we've had a golden age. I think there are openings, but I certainly don't think that the talk about evidence-based policy or practice is anywhere near matched by what would be helpful. We do, I think, have a bit more focus on outcomes in many areas of policy and practice. I know up here there's a current debate about educational outcomes, and I see some wry smiles in the audience as I say that, both intended and unintended. But it's also true of a lot of the work that has been done, and I think a lot of this has been really informed by number and database social science, because that's where you really get a sense of what the outcomes are when you talk about benefit cuts or juvenile justice in contact with the court system and so on. And in practices, what should teachers or child social workers do in certain types of cases? This is mirrored in medicine. You know, what do we know about the epidemiology, the statistical range of cases about what clinicians do versus the clinician saying, well, I think this is the right course. And a lot of what we get in these number and database analysis is a certain sense that it increases complexity. After all, a big debate in a lot of the schooling debates do grammar schools down south of the border, do they change outcomes because of the school or because of the way that pupils are selected into the school? And that's such a fundamental problem of most of the social science that needs to have policy bite, is you've got to think about what kind of social, self-structured, socially structured, physiological, biological, what kind of selection mechanisms are driving things other than the immediate period you're looking at. Indeed, I think part of the reason that there is more interest in outcomes generally across a lot of policy areas is that the social sciences, since the 60s at least, have accumulated a wealth of evidence that shows that many policies, many social changes just haven't had the outcomes people predicted they would. Common sense isn't always a good way to predict what will happen when you change teaching techniques, for example. And that changes of 2 or 3 percentage points may be a big social change over time, even though they aren't as dramatic as the proponents of a policy might like them to be. Though I note that advertisers usually feel comfortable enough with changes of behavior of that magnitude. And even economics, which is a comparatively hard social science, can't always explain why people don't act in their own economic self-interest without bringing in other evidence, fruitful collaborations with psychology in the form of behavioral economics. I'd like to see more network-based analysis, without actually drawing into question the kind of deterministic element of what they're doing. So issues about outcomes, trying to understand what really causes what, are the sorts of pathways which I think need objective, robust, skeptical social science with numbers and data as at least part, and a very important part, of their discussion. But of course, we then get right into the world of complexity. We ask whether something is actually a correlation or an association, doesn't establish causation. So we need more research to test this. For instance, I ended up funding, when I was at the Nuffield Foundation, some work on marriage versus not being married for relationship stability where they're young children, in the face of purported policies that we would try to encourage people to get married. Now, the married are less likely than those who cohabit to separate. That's true. But it's also because people who have more education, higher income, higher family of birth income, as well as their own income, are more likely to get married. So what is it that's protecting against separation? Is it being married, Or is it the fact that it's a form of social selection and that people who have something to gain, people where both partners have choices, where they've deferred certain choices, much less likely to have children very young, are less likely to get separated or divorced? And no amount of personal anecdote will sort this out. We needed a very sophisticated set of quantitative analysis which spelled out assumptions at every stage about what different ways of configuring the model might imply about what you thought was an endogenous cause. You really needed to spell all of that out. But we also have to note that social science explanations are often probabilistic rather than deterministic. After all, we all know quite a fair number of highly educated and well-off people who've been long married and got divorced. How big a difference matters, not just in the sense of being statistically significant, but substantially significant in real life, or certainly enough to drive a policy change. And we find out that what works in one social setting with one set of institutions doesn't always work when transported to another setting, and that may not be random, it may be related to context factors. Certainly, we now know with a lot of interventions that teachers or social workers or doctors who are trained, and not just cognitively trained, but given some real emotional motivation, are likely to do better than those who are less well trained. Patrick, yeah, thank you, Susan. So we are surrounded everywhere by probabilities, and the world moves on, and it can't wait until we have our ducks in a row. This, since there aren't very often kind of killer true facts, it does create quite a lot of space for alternative facts, and that's in a malign sense, not the people who have different interpretations, particularly when we're likely to keep saying more research needed. We've certainly seen the space this uncertainty creates again in the economic debates, the debates about the economic effects about Brexit. A majority of economists think this will reduce economic growth in the medium and long term. Uncertainty about negotiation will affect short-term decisions. But if you look at the debate during the Brexit referendum, you have not only to think about the claims that people don't trust or don't like experts anymore in general, but the kind of glee that's continued about the fact that the economic forecasts in the immediate aftermath of the referendum, when sterling tumbled but other economic indicators didn't, somehow vitiated all of that economic analysis. It was kind of gleefully said this was wrong. Well, I think we're all now seeing that those indicators take a while to react, and we will continue to see. It will be an empirical question, but I think it's pretty likely it's going to be a very bumpy ride. And there's room for proper debate and discussion about the truth of the forecast, but the Punch and Judy sideshow isn't always very helpful at a time when we're going to need a lot more evidence from economists and others about such issues as economic growth and employment, fishing and farming subsidies, and as we're doing at the Academy, looking at the support and the settings for universities and research. And that's just the economics. That's before we need to think about the effects of changes in immigration, not only economically but socially. So all this means that the role of numbers in the social sciences is more akin to ecology or climate science than physics. But that doesn't mean it isn't helpful in helping us think about complicated issues and get some way towards the truth. And while humans may not be like physical particles in physics, and I grew up in a Manhattan Project town, that's part of my shady past, Patrick, I think we've got to say that that doesn't fit with an approach that says it's all relative. And we as social scientists, I think, need to be very worried about a kind of completely relativistic approach. Numbers help us avoid this. Well, why? Well, they attune us, as I said, to selection, to questions of representativeness, and to our ability to generalize, among other things. And I think some of these issues are beginning to get a bit wider of understanding. I don't think social or self-selection is well understood. I'll come to an exception in a second. But I do think it's helpful in the face of people who prefer what I kind of call the focus group style of journalism, which is to ask people to understand and predict their own behavior. I'm not saying there's no role for that, but it doesn't seem to me the only route, and it certainly should not be the sole route to truth. Now, again, I think we know something about this if we look at political sciences, where we know that younger people are far less likely to turn out to vote than older people. And that's true even when they both say they're equally likely to vote. So their self-assessment is they're very likely to vote. The younger person will still turn out less often. And the excellent and careful work that Patrick and others have done in explaining why the opinion polls got it so wrong in 2015 meant first understanding something about the issue of selection, who took part in the opinion polls, were they representative, and then secondly, something about the weighting, which partly involves differential turnout of younger and older people. That's not the end of it, and I'm sure Patrick will ask you more if you question him. But I do think it shows that in these sorts of cases, the numbers and data help us argue back. If the analyses are set up to resist our own biases, it was just not the case that the polling industry could argue with the sort of evidence that was presented by Patrick, because the analyses were set out very clearly, the hypotheses were kind of looked at vis-a-vis each other, the assumptions that were being made were set out clearly. It did kind of make it hard to ignore. So to my mind, what numbers and data often do is provide a kind of grit in the oyster in the face of obdurate reality in some way that and I, again, know I'll talk about the epistemology if someone really wants to, but still. Now, why don't we use it more often? Why don't we have more often? What isn't supply one of the reasons it doesn't have the effect it should have on policy and practice? Well, I've long argued that it should. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but I would say that too many social scientists do lack basic tools to even do relatively simple things. I think it is being redressed now. Things are better, but it's still very hard in a system with such early educational specialization. This is even more true in England and Wales than it is in Scotland, where I think the system with Highers, in theory, gives an advantage in that people are handling numbers for longer in school. But for many years, it was only in economics, some politics of psychology and other disciplines that there was a widespread expectation that all social scientists needed to have hands-on training and experience in social science using data and number. And there was a sort of market failure because of who staff were and what student demands were and so on. And I think that has affected the supply of what kinds of evidence we have available. And this was certainly part of the reasoning behind the Q-STEP program, which I did help develop while I was at the Foundation, along with the ESRC and HEFGE. And of course, Edinburgh has a thriving Q-STEP center here. And I know my former colleagues at the Foundation and all those involved are going on to even greater things. But it's still a small initiative compared to the big structural forces that I think cause problems. So that's one reason. I think there is another set of concerns we have now, which is that data analytics is kind of stepping into the vacuum of not having enough good social science. So you get people who are very good at algorithms, at doing data analysis, but don't always understand not only the social processes, but necessarily even the process by which the data they're using were generated. So again, the famous case of this is the Google flu vaccine, which for a few years the Google flu inquiries, which for a few years were a very good predictor in the US of prevalence of flu. But then as more and more people used it in different ways, actually it became a very bad predictor. And there's some evidence that social media may be better because people are telling people things rather than the worried well looking up their flu symptoms. But still, we need to think more about where data come from, and that's something social science does. So I spend a lot of time in my current job saying, if we don't occupy this space, somebody else will. And I think that's particularly important if we're looking at what's likely to be the only growth area for social sciences. And important that it should grow, but it is, I think, going to be the only growth area is interdisciplinary research, which require research collaborations over time and an infrastructure to make that possible. It's certainly one of the reasons we've seen the reorganization of UK public funding for research under UK R&I. I think the social science alone budget that comes from the ESRC and other public funding will decrease. Certainly we know central government spend has decreased. I just think the problems that are big and seen as important are interdisciplinary, and actually a lot of them are very interested, but this is going to be the growth area, and the social sciences, while they should be well placed in theory to benefit from this, will do better if they continue being able to talk to colleagues using data and number. So increasingly we expect sophisticated psychology about child development to attend to genetic influences, family structure and formations, and educational institutions in the form of schools. We expect economic studies to attend to behavioral factors. We expect studies of health to look at the context within which healthcare is delivered, and we certainly need a lot more good social science there, as a recent Academy of Social Science report argued, and about how to change individual behavior when so many of the things that might contribute to health and longevity are driven by behaviors which I don't think are best viewed as solely individual. They're product of big social changes, taxing sugar, alcohol, those sorts of things, as well as individual behavior, but we still need more research about it. Certainly, we need more research, we need more attention paid, and it was dispiriting to read the recent government consultation on industrial strategy, where we drew attention to the fact that that doesn't just mean investment in new technologies, but thinking about productivity, town and city planning, social structural networks, long and short-term investment incentives. All those are social science issues, and those are the sorts of areas that I think we need to attend to. Now, as I said, this involves infrastructure, and I won't cover that issue now. But all of that is to say we don't have a great supply of social science in those areas. We don't have enough supply of number and data. I'm glad to hear the ESRC is funding further work of the sort that AQMeN's doing here, because I do think those need to have infrastructure funds, not just project-based funding. But I also don't think we make the best case to increase the demand for the sort of research we do. So it's not just that we don't have enough of it, we don't make it always very appealing to use it well or for funding it well. We haven't captured the public imagination, much less public commitment, about issues such as the need for government to collect and look at better evidence before they roll out what are essentially experiments in people's lives. And I don't mean by this that politics can or should be reduced to technocratic issues, or that evidence drives everything. I don't think that's possible, as I've said anyway, and I don't think it would be desirable. Politics is about much more than means ends. It involves values. It involves views about different endpoints. It involves trade-offs between them. I think I know my personal views on this. I think I have some sense of where evidence helps you with those, but there are still issues that are not evidence-driven. But really, when claims are made that policy change will result in particular outcomes, we ought to be able to expect to see better evidence, and we ought to play our part in trying, and I appreciate it's only an effort, to make sure there's some public discussion of that. And again, I want to applaud here Susan McVie's work and the work of Leslie McCarr and others in the Edinburgh Youth Study, because I think that really took quite a lot of work, not just to do the analysis, but to keep pushing the evidence. So And I bear the scars of trying to get Sure Start implemented in a way that was more evidence-friendly. I certainly have a lot of experiences in children and family law where we know evidence is hard. So I'm not saying it's all up to us efforts, and please, if we work harder, it'll all be great. But I do think we need to look at some of the one of the structured reasons why we're not getting much grip. I know there's cultural skepticism, and Susan refers to it in her foreword about lies, damn lies, and statistics, which is used everywhere. Anyone says, well, you can prove anything you want with numbers, and the answer to that is, of course, you can't. And I've talked about the probabilistic nature of social science. And I know there are vested interests too. You know, if talking about redistribution to a government that doesn't want to, or talking about academic excellence to a government that doesn't want to make that its be-all and end-all is very difficult. But I don't think we're very good at telling stories about our evidence, and I do think that is harder when there are numbers involved. After all, we think the evidence should speak for itself. It's been debated, pored over by peer reviews, critical reviews, published, goes into a further conversation, and surely then the social scientist has done his or her part. And part of me gets that. You know, I read Weber too. I certainly wouldn't suggest that social scientists, as scientists, always have a duty to do more. But empirically, I think it's important that a fair few numbers of social scientists not only care about impact because of the REF, which will be known to the academics here, but because they see they need to engage probably more directly and more consistently with policymakers, practitioners, and the public. And that latter, public engagement, does seem particularly important to me in a world of fake news. Now, this is where stories come in, and by that I don't mean something as simple as writing or speaking appropriately for the office. We all know, for the audience, we all know in theory that our attachment to jargon may be held on to in the name of precision, sometimes prestige, I think, in subgroups, but it isn't always very helpful in public engagement. I'm not saying just that we need to be better at communicating, or that we need to tell more anecdotes, which can counter the kind of vox pop beloved by television or newspapers, much though all those are useful things. But while I still think it's important that social science, social scientists have some allegiance to a value of truth, I have to say, if you look at empirical studies of how evidence does actually affect policy or practice or debate, then I think we've got to think about the role of stories. So across all the kinds of evidence we need, summaries or syntheses, descriptive research, evaluations, research that looks at causes, it's just very rarely the case that the written word, much less the written word in a single output of the written word, a single publication, has the kind of influence that a kind of hydraulic notion of impact would suggest. This isn't novel. This kind of analysis has been going on since at least Carol Weiss's work back in the 70s. And of contemporary writers, I really recommend Paul Kearney and Catherine Oliver, contemporary political scientists. And Kearney writes a very good and interesting blog. But the key fact that the usual recipes, write clearly, build relationships with policymakers, follow policy debates, and be opportunistic in a principled kind of way about choosing the right time to engage aren't really enough. And it isn't just a case of saying it will take years for things to have effect. But if we believe that social science isn't just superior journalism, then I think we have to take seriously that one of the things it has to do is think about how to get emotional engagement with policymakers and the public. After all, we know behavior change when there is an affective dimension as well as a cognitive one. And we need to think about how we tell a comprehensible story using our complex data. It needs to feel as if the research matters, that it addresses something important. Now, even talking about this makes me feel uncomfortable because, I really do care about the truth of social science. I suspect civil servants who need to work with their ministers and their colleagues and people in the third sector are more used to this, although they often, it seems to me, twist the evidence, and that worries me too. And I'm certainly not suggesting that. But I do fear in the world of today, where we have the competing simplicity of fake news, where we have data analytics professions keen to use some of the same data and look at some of the same questions we social scientists have done, and where people can have more choice about the evidence they believe, we need to think a bit more about how we tell better stories using our hard-coded evidence. I'm not saying all social scientists should do it, but I do think we need to think about it. And if it's true of working with policymakers or practitioners, how do you persuade social workers to change practice? How do you change doctors to wash their hands? Proves to be an area where we know you need to get some emotional as well as structural change made so that nurses, for instance, can call out doctors. I think we need to take it even more seriously in public engagement. And here I think our natural and physical science colleagues are just way ahead of us without the incentive of ref impact case studies in seeing that they've got a moral obligation to engage in public discussion, debate, and communication, as well as a political and self-interested reason to do so, namely the fact that public funds are spent on research. And while far smaller, in absolute terms, funding is available for the social sciences, we are far more dependent as a discipline upon them. So I think we need to think about public engagement as an important aim and impact in its own right, as long as it's serious, sustained, committed, and so on, rather than acquiring evidence that has led the public to change their views in some way. And certainly for the academics among you, the Academy has argued that the social science, that this should be the case for the next ref, that public engagement needs to be seen as a good in its own right, which in fact most of the science panels tended to treat it as, whereas we social scientists went on in our inimitable way to say, can you show what percentage of the population has changed their mind or whatever? That does seem a disproportionate way of looking at things. But in that case, I think, as I said, that if policy makers and practitioners find it harder to engage with social evidence involving data and number, it's still very much the case that a well-chosen anecdote can trump, if I can use that word in a sentence that combines evidence and politics, the most rigorous and conclusive quantitative evidence, then it's doubly so for public engagement. Now, partly it's because number skills aren't well spread, partly it's because of these other issues, but I stress again that I think we need to think more about how we do engage people. And it's not just a few infographics. I do think there's a piece of work to be done here. And as people like Paul Kearney himself, and other political scientists, we have to ask ourselves, how far do we go in feeling comfortable in exercising the arts of emotional seduction, even if they're taught us partly by social science? And I would add, do we have the skills? Though many of my friends are quantitative social scientists, I've never quite thought of them as Casanovas. So I think this is a real issue. So I want to end on a brief note of hope with some practical thoughts. One of the ways in which the world seems to me to have improved is the growth of various institutions outside universities, intermediaries, that are both committed to robust evidence and want to ensure that it is useful to policy or practice or debate. The Institute for Physical Studies has long been in this category, but I'd say the Resolution Foundation, for one, is there. Very strong good use of evidence, but also very concerned that it is presented in a way that tells a story that policymakers of all parties can at least grapple with. Newspapers increasingly seek outside content as their own business models. I mean, they need to fill the space. I've mentioned full fact and declared a conflict of interest. which has, I think, taken fact-checking to a new level of visibility and impartiality. In Westminster, at least, parliamentary select committees have more influence, I don't say power, I say influence, than previously, as they've had elected chairs since 2010. And in itself, that was partly an evidence-driven change, as Meg Russell did some excellent work on that. I don't think that's true up here in Scotland. I don't think the chairs of the parliamentary select committees are elected by the Parliament as a whole, but it does give them more influence. So there are pathways where it's not just the social scientist who needs to be doing the telling of the stories, but can look for allies or partners. Now, finally, I think we need to accept, though, that this is going to take time, energy, resource. We need to be more attuned to the need to repeat stories to the audiences, and we need to think about partners, but that does require resources too. I suspect most people here tonight are committed to or interested in robust number and data-driven social science evidence. Otherwise, why would you come? But I gather if this is a mixed audience, some of you will have thought about these issues already, and I hope you'll have further discussions amongst yourself about it. I accept that different people will draw the line between the dry presentation of evidence and advocacy in different places, and I'd always counsel some self-awareness of the fact that you're doing so. But I have to say I no longer think, as I think I used to do about 15 years or so ago, that there's an alternative to having numbers and stories if we want hard-won evidence to matter to somebody. Thank you.
Very much, Sharon. This isn't on, is it? Do I have to do anything to it? Oh, there, thank you. Just volume. Okay, any questions for Sharon on anything she's covered there? Comments? I certainly have a whole long list of things, so if you want to shut me up, you better think of something to ask Sharon. I mean, one I think is really, really interesting, wide range of topics that you've linked together and covered, really important. And I guess one of the things that I was wondering about, that the sort of this idea of narrative, is how it connects potentially I'll maybe sort of challenge you in a little bit here with the sort of the other problem that we've got in social science, which you didn't say very much about, which is the replication crisis, the loss of confidence in the replicability of the work that we're doing. And I think, one of the things that drives that a little bit is the need for a narrative in your research. And we know that exactly your argument is kind of, we need a narrative to sell this to policymakers. It can't just be a bland piece of work. But once you have that narrative, that can often drive the empirical research, and you end up with someone saying, I've got a good narrative, I need to fit the data to it. Yeah. And so there is a tension. I very much take your point, but perhaps you could comment on that.
First of all, I think there are two slightly different issues here. One is replication, and one is, as you say, fitting the data. And that is a real worry. So as I said, I put forward some of these comments kind of hesitantly. You certainly see that again, I think in some of the Sure Start work with the kind of community empowerment narrative, driving away data about what kinds of interventions with families worked. You've seen that with the self-esteem movement. You see that with different ways of trying to ignore the effect of social selection in grammar schools. You see that in all sorts of areas. So I get that. It's why I think part of the concern is, how do you get people to care may not be a story about the data so much as a story about why it matters and what could happen. So that's there. But I accept this is really tricky, and I'm certainly not meaning to say, don't be aware of the fact that we have values too, and one of the biggest problems with social science is we select our problems and we select some of the assumptions we think are reasonable, not always as transparently as we should. I think that's very different from replication problems, which is more of a problem in some disciplines than others. After all, historical case studies kind of can't be replicated. But there are interesting statistical techniques for how you try to handle small n cases. But I think that's a slightly different issue. And one of the problems is you never know if a failure to replicate is simply because it was a rogue result or a bad study, or if one of the important conditions which wasn't understood to affect things has also changed. So, again, if you look at why particular practical interventions worked in Washington State but don't work in Norway, it's not always a case that they're just not replicated. It's that they're very different social conditions, and that can be very fruitful. So, again, partly my answer to this would be, wouldn't it, we really should have more funding, because then you could have more funding of things like replication. I can just tell you that is not going to happen over the next 5 years. We have been through the days up to 2010, which were, I think, the high point of spend, both in public and funding through universities, through QR, and funding through foundations, and funding through the EU. And I don't see any of those doing anything but steady state or diminishing for the next 5 years.
I mean, which is a different message than we get from the government, that money is sort of steady state. But I think perhaps maybe you could say something on that. I mean, is there, do you feel more influence from politicians in how money is coming down to, researcher level, in the sense that, as you said, it's going to be driven by interdisciplinary, challenge-led things, and there's more money going into these kind of work centres and so on.
Well, I first of all, I'm going to try to distinguish in my answer part of, I think, the kind of view that could be supported by the academy and personal view. But secondly, I think, again, it's complicated. What has always been the case is there's always been quite a subtle interaction by which government, with some right, determines some high-level priorities for some parts of the social science spend. And in fact, we in Britain, in the UK, have been freer of some forms of intervention than, say, the US, where it's not just recently you've had discussions about, we shouldn't fund politics, we shouldn't fund sociology, we shouldn't fund psychology, we shouldn't fund work on divorce, we shouldn't fund work on blah-bitty-blah-bitty. The fact of the matter is, in the US, you've just got a lot more money from all sources sloshing around, and that's very helpful. I'm less worried, although I think it obviously can happen, that we will have a greater kind of political control of research spending. I think it is the case that because there is less government departmental research of its own in the form of evaluations, there's a sort of pent-up demand. If only we could get the research councils to fund our evaluations, that really we should be funding out of government money. So I'm more worried about failures in the Rothschild principle than I am in the principle of Haldane and independence. On the other hand, as I said, it seems to me that the best we can hope for is that in kind of cash terms, where the budget of the ESRC for ESRC-led work might stay more or less constant, could be in real terms, but the growth area will be interdisciplinary. And that's partly because those were the reasons the government gave that extra money to the research councils. And the fact of the matter is, if you look at the 1,000 and some odd additional postgraduate awards given under the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, 60 went to the social sciences. That's for Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, 60. And we understand that in the end that was sort of given by research council spend, and the ESRC spends so much less, but that actually it was because there was a general feel on the part of some high up in government, and I don't say civil servants, that, industrial strategy is about the white-hot heat of technology, for those of us old enough to remember that phrase. So I think it's just going to be a tough time.
Christine.
Thank you for such a stimulating talk today. And I really love the idea of putting stories together with numbers. My issue is sometimes that this may mean that we start drawing conclusions from our number which go actually beyond the data themselves. So that is the risk that I always try to avoid as an academic, because I feel becomes a bit of going far ahead, much more, selling more than what actually data sometimes cannot say. So do you have any?
Well, only again that, I absolutely agree. And nothing infuriates me more than seeing people go far beyond and become pure advocates when their evidence doesn't support it. So I get that. It's why, as I said, I found real hesitation in saying I'm trying to say something about we need to do better at grabbing people's hearts and minds. But on the other hand, there is a kind of Faustian element in that, we say that and then we say, well, I can't quite know this, but if you'll now let me do a randomized control experimental intervention and, actually nail this and say what size effect, and it'll only take 10 years and cost umpteen £1 million. And no, I do that too. I mean, I've certainly advocated for that. We do need more of those sorts of experiments. I can think of so much money that's been wasted, as well as people's lives affected by the fact that we didn't do that. So I'm great in favor of that, but it isn't going to cut the mustard in most policy and practice debates. So all I can say is it's an uncomfortable feeling, and in the end you have to say, this far I can go and no further. But part of it is, I suspect, about having a better debate with some institutions, some intermediaries that are not concerned just to advocate for their final view, but do have more agility in thinking about how to get policymakers on board. And in fact, a lot of the evidence where evidence has driven policy have actually taken 20 or 30 years anyway. Things like how do we change smoking behavior? How do we change teenage parenthood? How do we do these things? It's very rarely the case that we do a quick intervention. An area that we've been prone to make big changes without a lot of evidence is education, because it's got an easy delivery mechanism, a school, where teachers can be told to do something a certain way, or they can be funded a certain way. And there you actually, because you've got so many schools and so on, you could actually do more quick studies. So again, part of me, if I ruled the world and had loads of money, would love to see more kind of quick evaluation units set up where you've got those circumstances. But all I can say is I agree with you. It's a danger and it's a worry. We should still think about it.
There's a question there.
Hi, Dorothy Curris from St Andrews University. Fantastic talk, thank you very much. So much of that rang true. I'm in an area looking at social determinants of health, and sometimes thought of as social science, sometimes thought of as health, depending on who you are. And as I say, it very much rang true for me. One of the issues I'm interested in is this idea of the intermediaries. I think that it's very important within our world, and I think it's something that perhaps we have problems finding those intermediaries at times, and if you find those, as you say, that can be very effective. And repeating the story again and again. And that's what the intermediaries, I think, often can do. We work with people like WHO and UNICEF. They each have their own agendas, but they're taking your information and presenting it in a slightly different way each time. Something you may not think of yourself, etc. So I think your point on that is very well made, and something we should make more use of with our research.
Yes, I think what's interesting is a lot of funders are more aware of this too. And I don't just mean in the social sciences. I think if you look at places like the Health Foundation, which I think has done some really excellent work in the kind of drive to innovation labs, and a lot of that is about social science evidence in affecting medical behavior. So not just individual behavior, but how doctors and work in hospitals are organized. I think a lot of funders are realizing we need to move beyond the project by project approach and think about the networks we need to build up.
There's person here, and then Celia.
Hi, I'm Ellie Bates. I'm the AQMeN Research Fellow in Criminology. I was interested in your comments about data analytics. I wonder if you could expand just a little. I was wondering whether our way forward on this, is it social scientists challenging data analytics and data science? Is it us working with data scientists, or is it actually us becoming data scientists ourselves as well as social scientists?
I think it's all of the above. I mean, I certainly don't, I'm sorry, I have a high regard for data analytics skills, and I don't think many social scientists have them. So I think thinking about alliances, fruitful working partnerships, partly again because I think they'll be intellectually stimulating, would be helpful. But I just observe those partnerships are more likely to be successful if people have a certain level of number and data skill themselves. It's very unlikely you're going to go in with the great theoretical insight that's going to drive that agenda. But all I am saying is that I've also seen a lot of what I think of as kind of cod social science under the guise of data analytics. And, you know, I think one of the interesting things about a lot of younger social scientists is they will take to Twitter or so on and say, well, let me explain why this isn't good, you know, this isn't likely to be correct over time because you haven't thought about these things. And it's not just a dripping with superior knowledge or contempt. It's a question of saying you got something wrong here because you didn't understand how the data were generated, you didn't understand selection processes. That may not matter if the only people you're interested in are Tesco club card holders, but it may matter if you're taking a wider population. I'd like to just see more social science give and take. And there are some cases where people do it, but I certainly think a lot of the sciences are really good about that. A lot of young scientists are getting really engaged in that.
Celia McIntyre, I'm a statistician in the Scottish Government. A lot of what you've said seems to relate to building relationships with people, and I just wondered to what extent you have evidence for that being aided when people move between sectors themselves, or, you know, that'll happen anyway, but I just wondered if there are situations where funding has been provided and it's facilitated a kind of increase in the person's knowledge because they understand the other side a bit more.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have very evidence that I would say stand up on number and data grounds, but I certainly think that is more, you know, it's more likely, partly too because it widens some of your networks. I think the policy literature does show that one of the dangers that a lot of policymakers, politicians and civil servants make is they come to rely on a few people who can they perceive use, you know, numbers well, but who can also tell them a good story and make, and the problem with that is thin, narrow networks may not work. Lots of policy problems get caused that way, whereas some movement in and out probably widens your networks. But I certainly think, again, the evidence is, quote, build a relationship. So then we get into, well, let's have practitioner and academic work, policymaker and academic workshops. And those are good. I'm not arguing against them. I just think part of the reason we don't create much of the demand needs to go beyond that.
Richard, the front here.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. That was very interesting. I had two comments. One was about the stories. I mean, I completely agree that, of course, one gets one's message across if one can give a good story. I think the problem is then that we run the risk of getting into a sort of a war of who can tell the better story. And then the question becomes, how do you judge between which of the stories is the better one? And you kind of worry that the criteria that are going to be used are going to be criteria that have got nothing to do really with the scientific content of the story and much more to do with the rhetoric and how it's put across. And the second question that second comment that I had, actually, I want to look at the other side of social science, really. You mentioned that you think that funding for purely social science research is not going to increase, maybe even going to diminish, that it's going to be much more interdisciplinary. I can see that. But I think one of the things that troubles a lot of people is that certainly in the UK, we have this enormous emphasis on impact and policy-related research. and that there's very little space in the funding agencies for any work which doesn't do that, or let me put it another way, doesn't claim to be doing that, because I mean, I think everybody feels now that even if your work is not really going to be of any interest to policymakers, you have to say it is. Right? And one of the difficulties, I think, for us in regard to Brexit is that one of the sources that we can turn to that doesn't ask for that is ERC funding, which is going to be lost to us. So I guess my second point is, do you see any future now for social science research which is not oriented, well, at least for the funding of social science research, which is not in some way orientated towards engagement, impact, and policy relevance, immediate policy relevance?
Let me just again say briefly, I agree with you. The danger is the person who has the better story wins. I think thinking about this question about overclaiming, I'm not always sure it's overclaiming. You know, part of me feels part of it is having a pithy line that people can remember even when they don't remember your structural equation modeling or your logistic regression. And again, let's face it, most politicians aren't going to follow that. Most of the senior civil service isn't going to follow that. So I accept the dangers, Richard, of all of that. I think more interesting, let me think about impact. First of all, I think empirically, I disagree that that enormous emphasis is given to impact in funding decisions or in REF-QR money. I mean, if you look at, again, this is not the time to have a long conversation about REF, most of the audience may not be interested, but previously, RAEs gave a systemic institutional disincentive to anyone spending any time or effort on anything but for academic publications. So I was among those who did say, I think a modest corrective would be useful. I worked with the British Academy in those days to talk about what I called Witherspoon's admonition. The worst outcome would be for really bad research to have a high impact. I know most funding, certainly ESRC funding, says give us your impact narrative, but actually they do say you don't have to claim impact. It's just if you've got it, you should talk about it. I agree there's a lot of overclaiming. I agree there's a lot of overclaiming about not only what the impact could be, but what will be done, and it never happens because that's not the way the institutional incentives work. So that part of it I don't think is quite as clear. I do think it's clear that the growth in UK money will be driven by impact in at least the medium term. So that's the interdisciplinary fund, which will be about solving problems like antimicrobial resistance and antibiotic resistance, that sort of thing. So I think that's, and I absolutely agree with you, and the Academy was one of the first to publish what we think are some differentially bad effects for the social sciences from Brexit. I'm not trying to say, because that's the reason you shouldn't vote for it or shouldn't want it to go ahead. But it's absolutely clear that the loss of EU funding and collaborative partnerships is going to leave quite a big vacancy. I think what I'm saying is empirically, I doubt it's going to be easy. I mean, government has announced a big new spend, which would keep things on an even keel for the first year or two after Brexit is scheduled. I don't think we'll see the same distribution going to the social sciences, because all the evidence shows the social sciences, although in absolute terms get a lot less, disproportionately UK social science benefits much more from ERC money and even other parts of framework money than the sciences or UK sciences or humanities. A very good report published by Technopolis last week. So I can merely say I share the worry that there won't continue to be discovery-based, blue sky-based, those are words from the natural sciences, but basic understanding-based social science. It's really important that we have it. I just think I'm a little less worried that currently the research councils, if you look at them, they still fund quite a lot of request-based, social science. I think what will be more of a problem is the new money coming in.
Okay, well, my job as chair was to keep things to time, and I failed on that, but I'm sure we could keep on going. But I think we've got a reception now, is there? Yeah, there is, so we can keep talking along these lines. So I'd like to thank you all for coming and being attentive. I'm sure that although this is kind of the final AQMeN event, that there will be more things coming down the line from Susan and the AQMeN people. So keep monitoring that, and we should close by thanking our annual lecturer for a really excellent, stimulating talk. Thank you, Sharon.